Elvis Presley, a name that transcends music, film, and even time itself. He wasn't just a singer, he was a revolution. The pompadour, the curled lip, the swagger on stage. Elvis was the embodiment of post-war American rebellion, sex appeal, and superstardom. With over 1 billion records sold, a string of blockbuster films, and a fan base that spanned the globe, Elvis was crowned the king of rock and roll. And for decades, the crown fit. But what happens when the crown becomes a cage? Few knew that behind the walls of Graceland, the king was unraveling. The lights dimmed, the crowds faded. And what remained was a man haunted by silence, prescription bottles, and an overwhelming sense of being trapped in a world he no longer recognized. In his final years, Elvis was surrounded not by friends or collaborators, but by handlers, doctors, and the echo of his own myth. The legend stayed alive, but the man inside was slowly disappearing. Every pill he took, every curtain he closed, pulled him further from the stage and deeper into isolation. So how does a man worshipped by millions end up dying alone on a bathroom floor at just 42? Today, we go beyond the legend. This is not the Elvis of posters and impersonators. This is the untold story of a man crushed beneath the weight of his own fame, of a king who never got to take off the crown. Before the screaming fans, the Las Vegas spotlights, and the golden jumpsuits, Elvis Presley was just a quiet, slender boy born in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. He came into the world on the 8th of January, 1935, but not alone. His twin brother, Jesse Garon Presley, was stillborn. That loss, though rarely spoken about in public, would cast a long, quiet shadow over Elvis's entire life. He would later say he felt like a part of him was missing from the beginning, a ghost that walked beside him, unseen. His family was poor, painfully so. Vernon, his father, did odd jobs and was once jailed for check fraud, leaving the family further burdened. Gladys, his fiercely protective mother, was the emotional center of Elvis's world. They were inseparable. She doted on him and raised him with a mix of deep religious values and constant worry, which gave Elvis a complicated relationship with guilt, love, and loyalty. Music was his escape. Gospel choirs at church, blues pouring from Beale Street in nearby Memphis, country songs on the radio, these were the voices that formed his identity long before he ever picked up a guitar. But it wasn't just music that shaped him, it was silence. The silence of hunger, the silence of loss, the silence of being different in a southern town where conformity was survival. Elvis was a shy child, often described as polite, awkward, and unusually emotional. Teachers remembered him carrying a guitar to class, but speaking little. When he performed for the first time in school at age 10, he shook with nerves, but when the applause came, something clicked. For the first time, he was seen. And that feeling, it never let him go. Later, when the world would call him wild and provocative, few would connect that image to the boy who once wore eyeshadow in high school, not for fashion, but to look like his movie idols. He was mocked, ostracized, even beaten for standing out, but he never stopped standing out. In some way, maybe he was always trying to become someone big enough to fill the space his brother left behind, or someone loud enough to drown out the quiet ache of being unseen. The boy from Tupelo would soon rise to change music forever. But the fragile core of that boy, his need to be loved, protected, and understood, would remain buried beneath every rhinestone-studded suit he ever wore. By the time Elvis Presley was 21, he had already lit a cultural wildfire across America. In 1956, he released Heartbreak Hotel, a haunting, bluesy ballad that hit #1 and stayed there. That same year, he made his national television debut, and the world changed overnight. The way he moved, the way he looked into the camera, the way he fused gospel, country, blues, and something entirely his own. Elvis wasn't just performing music, he was becoming a movement. Girls screamed, boys imitated, parents panicked, religious leaders condemned. Television networks demanded the cameras film him only from the waist up. Elvis wasn't just shaking his hips, he was shaking the moral foundation of 1952nd America. With hit after hit, Don't Be Cruel, Jailhouse Rock, Hound Dog, He dominated charts and airwaves. Hollywood soon came calling, and he starred in over 30 films, most of which critics dismissed but fans adored. His face was on lunchboxes. His voice poured out of every jukebox in the country. The king had arrived. But even as the world adored him, Elvis was already beginning to fracture under the weight of his own creation. His fame was not organic, it was engineered. At the center of it all was his controversial manager, Colonel Tom Parker, a man who saw Elvis less as an artist and more as a product to be maximized. Parker restricted his touring to the U.S., took a massive cut of earnings, and pushed Elvis into repetitive, uninspired film roles that Elvis privately loathed. Behind the glamour, Elvis was trapped in a gilded cage of overexposure and overwork. He craved artistic growth. He wanted to be a serious actor, to sing gospel on his own terms. But he was told, time and again, stick to the formula. The Elvis machine had to keep running. Then came the military draft. In 1958, at the peak of his fame, Elvis was shipped off to Germany. Fans saw patriotism, but for Elvis, it was the beginning of detachment. While abroad, he met Priscilla Beaulieu, just 14 at the time, and started a complex relationship that would define much of his private life in the years ahead. More importantly, he was introduced to something else: prescription pills. Uppers to wake up, downers to sleep, and tranquilizers to stay calm under pressure. By the time Elvis returned, the music world had begun to shift. The Beatles were rising. The soundscape was changing. But Elvis, still iconic, was no longer revolutionary. What the world didn't see was the growing rift between Elvis the performer and Elvis the man. One couldn't survive without the other, but together they were tearing each other apart. By the late 1962, Elvis Presley had everything: money, fame, a mansion fit for royalty, a beautiful wife, and a daughter who adored him. But none of it could quiet the storm growing inside him. He had become a prisoner of his own myth, trapped in the image the world expected, the swagger, the voice, the stage king. But the man behind the myth was unraveling slowly. And then, all at once, the first cracks came in his marriage. While the public believed Elvis and Priscilla lived a fairy tale life inside Graceland, the reality was far more distant. Elvis was often emotionally unavailable, spending nights in his upstairs bedroom, surrounded by books on spirituality and metaphysics, while Priscilla slept alone downstairs. He was obsessed with the afterlife, numerology, even UFOs, anything that made him feel connected to something bigger, something that could explain the ache he couldn't name. He began surrounding himself with a small group of loyal men, nicknamed the Memphis Mafia. Not friends, but buffers. They traveled with him, ate with him, stayed up late talking nonsense in hotel suites, but none of them truly knew how to reach him. Elvis trusted almost no one. He was paranoid, anxious, increasingly isolated even in a room full of people. His dependency on prescription drugs worsened. By the 1972nd, he was taking massive doses of opioids, barbiturates, amphetamines, and tranquilizers, many prescribed legally by his personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, who enabled his habit in the name of keeping Elvis functional. But functional was a moving target. On stage, Elvis could still roar when the mood struck, but off stage, he was often incoherent, bloated, and visibly unwell. One of the most painful tragedies came in 1973, when Priscilla left him. The woman he had once controlled both emotionally and physically walked away. And though he would never admit it, her departure shattered him. He never recovered emotionally. He grew more erratic, more indulgent, less connected to reality. Even his legendary comeback television special in 1968, or his sold-out performances in Las Vegas, couldn't mask the emotional freefall. Elvis was no longer performing for joy or connection. He was performing because he had to. The stage had become his only tether to identity. Without it, he didn't know who he was. In private, he began speaking of death often. Friends recall him saying he wouldn't live past 40. He spoke of wanting to see his mother again, whose passing in 1958 had left a wound he never healed. Elvis never fully grieved her loss, and in many ways, never forgave the world for taking her. There were attempts to intervene. A few close aides begged him to slow down, to seek real help. But Elvis didn't listen. Or perhaps, and he couldn't. The king of rock and roll could sell out stadiums in minutes, but he couldn't say the words, "I need help." In a revealing moment captured in private letters, Elvis wrote that he often felt like a puppet on stage, that his life was no longer his own, but belonged to the fans, the media, and the expectations he could never escape. And so, while the world saw rhinestones, fireworks, and screaming crowds, Elvis saw only shadows. And in those shadows, the man was slowly disappearing. By the mid-1972nd, Elvis Presley was a ghost of the man who once revolutionized music. His once slender frame had ballooned, his speech was often slurred, and his radiant stage presence flickered unpredictably. Yet night after night, he still took to the stage sweating, trembling, gripping the microphone like a lifeline, desperate to keep the myth alive. Graceland, his beloved mansion, had become less a sanctuary and more a gilded prison. Friends and staff spoke of an upstairs kingdom, a private floor in the house where Elvis lived like a recluse. Only a select few were ever allowed up there. Even his daughter, Lisa Marie, rarely ventured into that space without permission. There, he slept all day, stayed awake all night, and surrounded himself with books on spiritualism, death, and the afterlife. His health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from glaucoma, liver damage, hypertension, and an enlarged colon. But the greatest threat to his body was still the medicine cabinet stuffed with prescriptions that blurred the line between survival and self-destruction. In one stretch, his doctor had prescribed over 10,000 pills in less than 2 years. Some were for pain, some were for sleep, others were just to make it through the day. Publicly, the decline was undeniable. During a concert in Baltimore, he forgot entire lyrics. In Rapid City, he could barely lift his head. At times, fans didn't cheer, they wept. And yet, there were moments fleeting, brilliant moments when the magic returned. In 1977, just weeks before his death, he sang an aching rendition of Unchained Melody. Seated at a piano, sweating profusely, his fingers trembling, he delivered a performance so raw, so desperate, that even the band was moved to tears. It was as if, for those few minutes, Elvis was no longer performing. He was pleading. On the 16th of August, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive in the bathroom of Graceland. He was just 42 years old. The world gasped. News broke like thunder. Fans sobbed in the streets. The king was gone. But the tragedy wasn't just that Elvis died young. It was that he died alone, surrounded by staff, fame, wealth, and yet utterly alone. Not a friend by his side. Not a family member holding his hand. Just a closed door, a handful of pills, and the unbearable silence he had been running from his entire life. His funeral was massive, his legacy immortal. But those closest to him couldn't help but wonder if Elvis Presley had been allowed to be just Elvis. Would he still be here? Elvis Presley left behind more than a legacy of gold records, sold-out arenas, and iconic white jumpsuits. He left behind a question that still lingers in the air. What does it really mean to be the king? To the world, he was a cultural titan, the man who gave rock and roll a face, a sound, and a hip shake that shook an entire generation. His voice crossed racial, social, and generational lines. He made millions feel seen, heard, alive. But for Elvis, the title came with chains. Beneath the rhinestones and roaring crowds was a man begging for normalcy, a son still mourning his mother, a father who barely saw his daughter, a lover who never quite learned how to love without control, a seeker of God who got lost in addiction, a man who could not tell where Elvis Presley ended and the king began. His story is not just about fame, it's about what fame takes. It's about how a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, with a soft voice and a deep heart, became the most famous man on earth, and in the process, lost the right to simply be. But even in tragedy, his influence echoes. Generations of artists, from the Beatles to Eminem, cite Elvis as a pillar of their sound. Graceland remains a place of pilgrimage. And every time Can't Help Falling in Love plays at a wedding, Or a child discovers jailhouse rock for the first time, Elvis lives on. Perhaps that's the true cost of greatness, not just dying young, but becoming eternal in the eyes of strangers, while fading in the mirror you face alone. Elvis Aaron Presley was a king, but he was also a prisoner. And understanding both sides of that crown is the only way to truly honor his name. We remember Elvis Presley for the legend, the voice that never cracked, the hips that never stopped moving, the man who changed the world from a stage. But perhaps it's time we also remember him for the human he was when the curtain closed. Not the icon, the man. A man who laughed at silly jokes, who sang lullabies to his daughter, who wept for his mother behind locked doors. A man who, in the end, was looking for something we all seek: peace, purpose, and someone who truly understood him. If his story moved you, if it made you see past the glitter and into the shadows, share it. Because behind every legend, there's a human story that deserves to be told. And if there's another untold legacy you think the world needs to hear, drop their name in the comments below. Because behind every crown, there's a cost.